rockets and their interception by the Iron Dome, as seen in the Israeli and Palestinian skies, are disturbing and perhaps frightening to Beijing from afar. When Chinese Foreign Minister Wang chaired an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on May 16, he said, "Safeguard the security and rights of civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories," and he called for an urgent ceasefire. Many Chinese netizens, however, have a different attitude from the Chinese Communist Party. They are supportive of Israel. Why is there such a discrepancy? On the evening of May 10, Palestinian Hamas suddenly fired many rockets against Israeli neighborhoods. So far, more than 3,000 rockets have been fired. It is the most intense missile attack Israel has ever faced. Israel's Iron Dome air defense system has performed exceptionally well, intercepting more than 90% of the rockets with minimal civilian casualties in the face of the attack. As of May 19, 12 people have been killed on the Israeli side. On May 14, the Israeli army suddenly announced that the Israeli ground forces were assembling and would soon launch a ground attack on Gaza. Hamas made an immediate adjustment, moving many rockets, rocket launchers, and fighters into a network of tunnels to hide from the Israeli army. But this was a tactical deception by Israel to lure the snake into the hole. The Israeli military then quickly deployed 160 warplanes and carried out a 40-minute high-intensity strike on the tunnel network in Gaza, dropping over 450 bombs, missiles, and precision-guided missiles. The Israeli military launched multiple airstrikes on Gaza, killing 42 people, including 10 children, which was the highest single-day death toll since the conflict began. The Israeli military issued a statement that the Israeli forces had no intention of harming civilians. They were targeting the Hamas tunnel system underneath the roads in Gaza City. Hamas intentionally built its military infrastructure underneath civilian homes, and the collapse of the underground militia facilities caused the foundations of the civilian homes above to collapse, resulting in casualties. It is the heaviest blow Hamas has ever suffered. After the bombing ended that day, Hamas did not carry out any military activities for the most part. On May 17, the Israeli Defense Forces said that since the conflict between Israel and Hamas broke out on May 10, Israel has taken a variety of countermeasures and intercepted 6 drones. It is the first time the Iron Dome has intercepted a drone in combat. On May 10, the day Hamas launched its rocket attack on Israel, the United States, the European Union, and many other countries were the first to condemn the Hamas attack. The nations jointly expressed support for Israel's self-defense. In a statement released by U.S. President Joe Biden, he said, "Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas's indiscriminate rocket attacks." In the interim, the Chinese Communist Party is holding the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council. It remained silent from May 10 until May 16, when Hamas could not fight any longer due to Israel's intense airstrikes on the tunnel network in Gaza. The CCP began to speak out and demand a ceasefire. Its official media emphasize Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip on the one hand. Meanwhile, the CCP's media, Global Times, issued an editorial claiming that the United States has done a disservice to the world and hurt Muslims even more. So why does the CCP defend Hamas this way? What kind of organization is Hamas? Founded in 1987, Hamas is a Sunni Islamist organization that combines religion, politics, and militancy. It has its own armed forces. On the Palestinian-Israeli issue, Hamas advocates the destruction of Israel with violence. It is identified as a terrorist organization, not only by Western countries, but by some Arab countries in the Middle East, including Jordan and Egypt. However, in the CCP's broad propaganda in China and internationally, Hamas is described as a victim, a champion fighting for national rights, while Israel is an invader and a destroyer of peace. The extermination and destruction of Israel is a common goal of Iran and Hamas. In the past few decades, every time a tentative peace agreement was reached between Palestinians and Israelis, Hamas and its supporter, Iran, took the lead in destroying it using suicide bombings and other means. The same can be said of this war, which Hamas came prepared for. Jerusalem has always been considered by both Israel and Palestine as their holy city, with many residents living on both sides. The mix of historical disputes, land grabs, and religious clashes has made the area a source of friction and conflict, large and small, virtually every time during the Muslim month of Ramadan. In mid-April, after the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, an Israeli court ruled on a land dispute between Israeli and Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah district, issuing eviction orders against several Palestinian families, leading to large protests on the Palestinian side. This was supposed to be a civil dispute that is commonplace, but Hamas quickly issued an ultimatum demanding that Israeli police and Israeli residents evacuate the Temple Mount at the Sheikh Jarrah area by a deadline. Israel ignored it. Hamas then immediately launched a massive rocket attack at 6 p.m. on May 10. What was originally a police-civilian conflict, a relatively controllable incident, instantly escalated into a national-level, uncontrollable war. In 2014, an official Iranian body admitted that Iran had provided Hamas with the technology to build rockets. Al Jazeera reported that most of the $260 million Hamas spent on building tunnels and weapons in 2017 came from Iran. A Chinese professor has written in a paper that 10% of Hamas's funding has come from Iran since the 1980s, and as early as 1992, Iran gave Hamas $10 million a year from the proceeds of oil sales. Iran also provides Hamas with camps for military training and logistical support. What is puzzling is that the U.S. economic sanctions against Iran have been in place since 1979, and Iran not only has not collapsed economically, but has also developed its military technology. It can even support other terrorist groups. Are there other forces behind it? In 2009, Israel discovered that Hamas rocket launchers came from Leyang steel pipe factory in Shandong province. Although, up to now, there is no more evidence that the Chinese Communist Party is directly behind the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, many critics believe that the turmoil in the Middle East is objectively in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. The 9/11 incident moved the U.S. attention to the Middle East to fight terrorism, allowing the Chinese Communist Party to grow bigger. Former U.S. President Donald Trump made a strategic move to shift the U.S. focus from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific region and prepared to deal with Beijing with full force. It has made the Red China panic. To break the current U.S. government's increasingly shaped Indo-Pacific strategic encirclement, plunging the Middle East into war and chaos all over again is one of the strategies that the Chinese Communist Party can use. But perhaps Beijing does not want the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to continue for a long time, as it tries to connect Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe through its Belt and Road project. A prolonged Israeli-Palestinian conflict would also affect the Communist Party's One Belt, One Road project and its vast investments in the region. Therefore, it is likely that Beijing will choose to walk the balance and intervene in a high-profile manner at the right time to demand a ceasefire. However, the footage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict shown in China has triggered something unexpected for the Chinese Communist Party. For example, about 460 of the more than 3,000 rockets fired by Hamas were oops rockets that fell in the Gaza Strip and injured Palestinians. This prompted Chinese netizens to ridicule Hamas's rockets as being a combination of steel pipes from Leyang steel pipe factory and gas canisters. The advanced weapons and innovative tactics of Israel also wowed the Chinese. For example, Israel's Iron Dome system can intercept more than 90% of the rockets fired by Hamas. Many Chinese netizens marveled at Israel's military strength. Comments left under the news included, "Terrorists don't deserve sympathy." Israel's King's Army hurried to liberate Gaza, eliminate Hamas, and save the people of Gaza from suffering. People are not easy to fool now. Support Israel. This innovative tactic by Israel is the first time Hamas, a longtime terrorist, has seen it, and it is equally alarming to Beijing. Israel's new strategy of warfare is to target high-ranking officials while leaving civilians alone. Israel now has the addresses of many of the most powerful figures in Hamas. For civilians who live in the same buildings as the big guns, the Israeli army calls or drops leaflets to warn the civilians to evacuate their homes before the attack and then bombs the buildings an hour later. As a result, Israel has done very little damage to Palestinian civilians since the war broke out. It has, however, killed dozens of Hamas's intelligence chiefs and army generals. It is a wake-up call for many Chinese in particular. Hamas once said, "The people are our brick wall." Israel says, "We are the people's brick wall." Red China treats the Chinese people as hostages. But this time, Israel killed Hamas's leader with a precision that the Chinese Communist Party had not expected. In future wars, What if the world follows Israel's example and lets go of the common soldiers and civilians and targets only the top leaders of the Chinese communists? Israel's Iron Dome system is undoubtedly the highlight of this conflict. It is a mobile air defense system suitable for use in all weather. In the face of the escalating risk of war in the Taiwan Strait, it may be worthwhile for Taiwan to consider the purchase of short-range missiles and long-range rockets to counter the Chinese Communist Party. Continuing part of the previous president's policy, the new U.S. administration approved $735 million worth of precision-guided weapon sales to Israel earlier this month. But at the same time, Biden said he would return to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, reversing the Trump presidency's decision to withdraw. On May 19, Biden spoke by phone with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hoping that Netanyahu would significantly de-escalate the conflict and urging a ceasefire. Netanyahu, however, vowed to continue his operation against Hamas. Rebecca Heinrich, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, tweeted, "If Israel thinks it doesn't have a committed backer in the White House and is worried about a new Iran deal that would flush the regime with cash, which it would spend on proxies like Hamas, why on earth would we think Israel would pump the brakes now before all the major targets are destroyed?" Israel and the Palestinians have reached a ceasefire agreement on May 20. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said he plans to meet with Israel and Palestinian leaders to discuss post-ceasefire recovery efforts. However, no one knows how long the ceasefire will last.